There are many .NET test automation frameworks. The most popular frameworks include MsTest, NUnit, and XUnit. SpecFlow is framework agnostic, which means that it integrates with whatever testing framework you choose. So what framework should you choose when automating your tests using SpecFlow? We will find out in this video. If you are starting from scratch and want to set up your test project, I highly suggest using the Visual Studio project template installed with the Visual Studio 2019 SpecFlow extension. By the way, if you haven't installed the Visual Studio SpecFlow extension up to this point, you definitely should do it now. It provides project templates and offers syntax highlighting and many more features that help your developer life when working with SpecFlow. In Visual Studio, when creating a new project, we can use the SpecFlow project template to set a project name and its location. On the next page, we can select the framework we want to target. All code samples in this video are based on .NET 5. The last two options are relevant for our test setup. We can choose a test framework from MsTest, NUnit, XUnit, and the SpecFlow Runner. The last dialog option allows us to add fluent assertions to the generated project. The projects we use in this video were all created using the SpecFlow project template. I created a test project for each framework and I didn't select the fluent assertions option. We will go through the available test frameworks and take a look at what differences they have and what similarities they share. At the end of the video, I help you make a decision on what framework makes the most sense in your situation. Before we can jump into the test code, let's take a look at the demo project to see the code we want to test. In this scenario, we have a bank account class with account ID, account number, and balance as properties. Next, we have an iMoneyTransferService interface which declares a sendMoney method with 3 parameters. We also have an implementation for this interface called MoneyTransferService. The implementation is simple and subtracts the amount from one bank account and adds it to another. The sendMoney method is the behavior we're going to test. MsTest is the default testing framework when working with C# and Visual Studio. Microsoft is the developer of MsTest, but starting with version 2, it is an open source project hosted on GitHub. Version 2 of MsTest is cross-platform. If you create a new project and want to use MsTest, version 2 is what you want to use. Now let's take a look at the MsTest project. We have a moneytransfer.feature file with a simple SpecFlow scenario where a bank employee transfers $500. Given the account A has a balance of $10,000 and account B has a balance of $7,650, when $500 are sent from account A to account B, then the account A has a balance of $9,500 and the account B has a balance of $8,150. We're going to use the same feature file for every test framework we use in this video. Now let's take a look at the step definitions file. I won't go into details about the step definition file as it's not the scope of this video. However, I want to mention that most of the code in this file depends on the business logic and SpecFlow components, including the scenario context. There is almost no code depending on MsTest as the test framework. The only place where MsTest plays a role is in the then step implementation, where we use assert methods from the Microsoft.visualstudio.testtools.unit testing namespace. Now let's take a look at the code that SpecFlow generates from the feature file. As we can see, the generated code uses the testing framework we selected when creating the project. We can see the MsTest specific attributes, including the test class attribute, the test context, and the test method attribute, among many others. We don't need to edit this file, but seeing what code gets generated under the hood is interesting. Last but not least, let's take a look at the only remaining file in this project. We open the MoneyTransferService test file, which contains 2 unit tests. The first method has the test method attribute attached and implements the same test case we saw in the SpecFlow test before. In the second test method, we use the data test method attribute and the data row attribute to provide the test method with multiple sets of data. The goal is to execute the parameterized test as many times as there are sets of data. When I execute the second test case, we run into an issue with MsTest. We provide integer values in the data row attribute but expect decimal arguments in the method. MsTest does not convert the values for us and instead throws an exception. There is no quick fix for this. We cannot set the values in the data row attribute as decimals because the compiler throws an exception. Let's leave it there and take a look at the next framework. NUnit is an open source testing framework. It was originally ported from JUnit, a popular Java testing framework. However, the latest version, NUnit 3, is a rewrite of the framework offering new features and supporting a wide range of .NET platforms. Due to its long history, NUnit is used in many projects worldwide and has more than 140 million downloads on NuGet. Let's take a look at the code. As mentioned before, we use the same feature file for NUnit. Under the hood, SpecFlow generates tests using the NUnit framework. If we open the moneytransfer.feature.cs file, we can see the test fixture attribute, the description attribute, and the test attribute used to define the test cases. Now let's take a look at the step definitions. The code is almost identical to the code we used in the MsTest project. The only difference is the namespace of the assert class, which comes from the NUnit.framework namespace. Last but not least, let's take a look at the unit tests. We have the same test cases as before. However, we don't need to attribute the test class and we use the test attribute for a test method instead of a test method attribute. What's interesting is that we can now execute the second unit test. We use the test case attribute, which allows us to define two separate datasets as input data for the test case. While MsTest couldn't handle the decimal data types, we don't run into any issues with NUnit and the test cases execute. XUnit is an open source testing framework with a focus on the community. While MsTest is directly from Microsoft and NUnit is a port from the Java world, XUnit was developed with the .NET developer community in mind. Some of the XUnit maintainers were former maintainers of NUnit. The core idea behind XUnit is to reduce code duplication and code optimization. One of the things that you'll notice quickly is that XUnit uses interfaces instead of attributes for many tasks, and it should allow writing cleaner test cases. The biggest strength of XUnit is its extensibility. If you want to build a rich testing experience, XUnit allows you to extend the built-in functionality. XUnit also allows us to execute tests for different frameworks. For example, you can target .NET Framework 4.8 and .NET 5. XUnit will execute all your tests for the defined target frameworks. Let's take a look at the code. Again, we use the same feature file with the same test scenario. This time, the generated code uses XUnit under the hood. In the step definitions file, we again have the same steps as before. This time, the assert class is imported from the XUnit namespace and offers a slightly different naming for its methods. Other than that, the step definitions are the same as discussed before. Remember that if you choose to write your assertions using Fluent Assertions or any other assertion library, the step definition files wouldn't differ between those three test frameworks at all. It could be why you want to use Fluent Assertions in your projects, so that you aren't writing your assertion statements depending on the test framework you're currently using. Let's take a look at the unit tests. We have the same two unit tests again. We don't use any attribute on the class level. We use the fact attribute, and for the data-driven test, we use the theory attribute followed by the inline data attribute, providing the dataset. XUnit can convert the integer values provided in the inline data attribute to the decimal type required by the method signature. Let's execute all the test cases in the solution. What framework should you choose? There are certainly differences between those frameworks. MsTest is the default framework when creating .NET projects. MsTest works great for simple test scenarios. If you already have an existing test project using MsTest, you can add SpecFlow features to the same project and use the same testing framework for both SpecFlow scenarios and unit tests. NUnit has a wide adoption and there are countless Stack Overflow questions and blog posts about it. If you get stuck, you'll most likely find a solution online. On the other hand, NUnit is based on a port from Java and still has a few limitations and maybe doesn't feel .NET native. However, as this video only contains simple test cases, it's fair to say that NUnit is a viable alternative, especially if people on the team are familiar with it. NUnit is part of the .NET Foundation. XUnit is the most modern framework out of the three. It's gaining popularity and offers new approaches compared to the other frameworks, utilizing interfaces over attributes where applicable. If you want to extend your test infrastructure, you'll be most happy if you choose XUnit. XUnit is also part of the .NET Foundation. I choose XUnit for new projects because of its feature set and design choices that allow me to write the cleanest tests. Remember that you can always change the test framework you're using. For example, you can create a new project, use the new framework for new features, and maintain the existing tests in the existing test project. You can find a more detailed comparison on the following website, where you'll also find a table with the description of how to do different things with the frameworks discussed in this video. As we were only able to scratch the surface of the different testing frameworks in such a short time, I suggest watching the following video if you want to dive deeper into each testing framework. If you want a more powerful test runner for SpecFlow that further boosts your automation productivity, check out the SpecFlow Plus Runner. The SpecFlow Plus Runner supports parallel test execution with test retries. You can also execute your tests for multiple target environments or configurations. Take a look at what the SpecFlow Plus Runner provides that other test runners don't support. Thanks for watching and see you next time.